This ayah from Surah Tariq is very often the center of discussion, especially among those who attack Islam, claiming that there is a clear scientific error which can potentially disprove the entire Quran. But is there? Well, it says here, "So let man observe from what he was created. He was created from a fluid, ejected, emerging from between the backbone and the ribs." And so the claim is that this fluid responsible for creating the man does not come from that area, but from a different organ. And so this means that this ayah contains a clear scientific error, and so it cannot be from Allah. But is this true? And how is that even possible? And how can we properly understand this ayah? Well, first of all, of course, it is not true. And the explanation is actually far simpler than you think. But before we proceed with the answer, I urge you not to miss the second part of this lesson, because it will be far more important than the answer itself. So watch the whole lesson to really learn something important. So, as for the answer, this claim can actually be refuted from many different perspectives, linguistically, medically, and believe it or not, even historically and through balagha. Let's see how that is possible. First, linguistically, the ayah says, يَخْرُجُ مِن بَيْنِ الصُّلْبِ وَالتَّرَائِبِ. Now, this particular sentence contains an implied pronoun, or in Arabic we call it ضمير مستتر. So, when we literally translate this ayah, it would be, there is a subject at the beginning that is not explicitly mentioned, emerges from between the backbone and the ribs. This implied pronoun could certainly refer to the fluid, the closer reference, but it could also refer to the man, which was mentioned earlier. But how can this be possible? Well, in Arabic grammar, it is completely acceptable and often stylistically powerful for a pronoun, especially an implied one, to refer back to a more distant reference if the context supports it. So it doesn't have to be the closest reference. And this is actually used in more than one place in the Quran, like in this ayah from Surah Al-Kahf. فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ رَبِّي جَعَلَهُ دَكًّا. The pronoun here does not refer to the closest possible reference, the promise, but actually to a reference mentioned a couple of ayat earlier, the barrier. Yet, we all simply understand the reference perfectly fine because of the context. Similarly, in the sequence of the ayat here, we can understand that the implied pronoun is referring to the man, and that يَخْرُجُ مِن بَيْنِ الصُّلْبِ وَالتَّرَائِبِ would then mean that the man is the one that comes out from between the backbone and the ribs, as then reference to giving birth, where the baby is then literally born from between the two areas mentioned. And so, the ayah would be 100% accurate. But then, what if the implied subject was actually referring to the fluid itself, not man? We would then be in trouble, right? I mean, that gushing fluid is known to come from the scrotum area, right? Well, here's the thing. Historically, this is nothing new. In fact, in Sahih al-Bukhari, it is narrated that the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, once asked him for permission to castrate themselves during a battle to control their desires. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, of course, forbade it. But this clearly shows that they knew where semen came from and how it could be physically prevented. Despite this knowledge, the companions never objected to the meaning of this ayah or even found it to be remotely inconsistent. So, if they, the most fluent in Arabic, and while knowing this fact, didn't see any issue in this ayah, why would we assume that we understand this ayah better than they did? But still, how can it ever be accepted that the fluid comes from between the spine and the ribs? Well, there is even a balagha aspect to this. But how's that possible? Well, when we say the king won the battle, does that mean that the king personally fought every soldier? Of course not. We mean that his army won on his behalf, yet we attribute the victory to him. This is what we call in balagha a metonymy, where something is referred to by something closely related to it, or in this case, where the orders originally came from. But what does that have to do with anything? Well, saying that the fluid comes from between the backbone and the ribs is a reference or a metonymy to a specific nervous system control called the somatic innervation, which controls the reproductive process, particularly the scrotum, which in turn controls the ejecting fluid. You want to guess where that neural control is located? Well, it is literally between the backbone and the ribs. Even more remarkable is that during the fetal development, the gonads, or just simply the reproductive system, begins its formation in that spot, between the spine and the ribs. A fact that was actually recently discovered, yet the Quran was accurately referring to it more than 1400 years ago. But wait, there is more. Even from a medical point of view, and even when not referring to the source, the ayah would still be 100% accurate, since it would then refer to what is called the seminal vesicle, which is the actual place where the fluid is produced and gushes out. But that doesn't really look like it is between the spine and the ribs, does it? Well, in case you didn't know, in clinical anatomy and medical imaging, structures are regularly described as between others based on their position along the anterior-posterior or front-to-back axis, even if they're vertically higher or lower. So, the seminal vesicle is certainly still considered within the area between the spine as the backside and the ribs as the front side. So yes, it is still possible to look at it even from this angle. And this is exactly what I personally found the most amazing about this while researching this topic, which is that whichever angle you look at it, this sentence, this ayah, somehow applies to all of them all at the same time, yet very accurately. Isn't that miraculous? Now, for the most important part of this lesson, it is important to know that the Quran is not a science book. It is a book of guidance, and it is from Allah. It has been revealed 1400 years ago, and it has not changed since. Now, let me ask you this. How many scientific theories and even facts have been disproved, changed, or altered in the past 100 years, let alone if we want to go back further than that? So, what's the point? Well, you should not put a book that has not and cannot be changed against science, which is constantly changing and evolving. And if you do, you'll be putting yourself in grave danger. Danger? What does that mean? Well, let us consider this. Up until the 1920s, the sun was believed to be static, and that only we are the ones that orbit that static object. This was the established scientific fact up until the 1920s. But then afterward, it became scientifically acceptable that the sun does have an orbit and it does move in space. Now, imagine someone from the time before that discovery, which is not that long ago, was reading this ayah. And it is He who created the night and the day, and the sun and the moon, all in an orbit, are swimming. Now, it cannot get any more explicit than this. The science of that time says sun is static, and the Quran says the sun moves in an orbit. What would you think if that man rejected the Quran because it goes against science? Well, we can now see how stupid this decision would have been, because we now know more. So how do you know that any similar case that we see today isn't looked at in the same way maybe 50 years from now? The point is, the Quran is static because it is the absolute truth from Allah's unlimited knowledge. But science changes because it seeks facts using the limited information and resources that we have available today. That's why science can never be a criterion for the absolute truth. So every time you see a scientific error in the Quran, remember this very well. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my latest books with their video courses if you want to learn the Quran in Arabic or properly learn its tajweed. Check out the links in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, inshallah.